It's day one of a brand new metagame. Let's talk about some decks that are making waves at High Infinite. The buff to Lin Lee has given rise to a really interesting double my doubles deck. This is a list I got from Big Baby, but it is a space other players have played around in before. Moonstone and copies work very well with what Lin Lee is already trying to do. Copies obviously work with Victoria Hand. Victoria Hand works with Moonstone. So a lot of this deck sort of feeds into itself with various multiplicative style combo based gameplay. Now, this is a deck that is going to have different combos depending on how the game is playing out. So you are going to have some games where you're doing Lin Lee Frigga, and then you're going to have some games where you're doing V-Hand Frigga, and then you're going to have some games where you're doing cloning a Lin Lee, and things like that are going to be a little bit different game to game, but it is a little bit flowcharty, and largely the thing that this deck I think represents the absolute most is that I am still playing a little bit of Sholo, but I am not playing Deafening Chord in my Sholo anymore, and it's pretty 50-50 on if I am playing a Spider Ham. And those are largely the cards that prevented decks like this from being serious competitors in the previous metagame. Those cards being so cheap, easy, and free in terms of interaction were very good against specific cards that scaled and needed to have text in order to do what they did. V-Hand in particular, but also against a lot of things in this space. The fact that they are both now worse is a meaningful reduction in their power. It is a serious upgrade to a deck like this. Now, they could still end up being part of it, but the big reason this deck is at the beginning of the video is because if any change mattered in the OTA, in my opinion, the one that mattered the most is Deafening Chord is definitely no longer a free include. You have to think very hard about whether you want to blow a slot on a Deafening Chord in your deck when so much of the time it is doing literally nothing. It is difficult, and that difficulty has opened up space for onboard combo style decks like this to exist again. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about what Sholo looks like right now. Largely, what I've been seeing is hybridization of the package no longer being itself the only thing in the deck. I haven't seen a ton of traditional Sholo decks, by which I mean it's basically just Maverick and Scarlet Spider and Sholo for power. I've seen a lot more of people hybridizing, and this is actually the deck I spent the most time with, messing around with a couple of the cards in here. I've tried a couple of different iterations. Here's what I've landed on after playing a bunch myself, talking to Iris and Derek about where the deck is supposed to be at. Largely, I think this deck does a really good job of being a powerful deck both with and without Sholo, which is an upside and a downside. The upside is that this is obviously a really strong thing to be doing. The downside is sometimes it's not able to accommodate Sholo very well, and you do have to be a little bit prepared ahead of time with one drops if you're going to take a Maverick Sholo line, which means that sometimes you can't make obvious plays about like your Kate Bishop one drops if you don't have other one drops to play on the final turn of the game. That kind of stuff does come up, and you will have to plan that out. That's part of what Miles Morales is hopefully correcting for. It's just generally a deck that has a lot of beef in it, thanks to the baseline power of Sam, Batroc, Craven, Hydra Stomper as a core, and also a very reasonable ability to play a ton of power with Sholo Maverick on 5 and 6. That kind of stuff is very, very powerful, and this is fundamentally a deck that scales off of your play skill. The better you are, the better you're going to be at this. The only real interaction we have in here is Cosmo, and that is because we basically just have a really terrible Man-Spider matchup, full stop, if we aren't Cosmoing them. But that matchup becomes incredibly good once we start Cosmoing them. The rest of this is just being the biggest and best positioned mid-range deck, and hopefully that Cosmo and your point output will manage to keep combo decks a little bit out of your range. It should come as no surprise that people are trying Topaz in the traditional move package. This is Sizer's list. Cougar was doing the same thing, but with Ghost Spider over Juggernaut. Pretty straightforward idea here. This is still going to be a powerful thing to do. We now have 2 enablers, 4 move cards on turn 2 that are going to give us repeated procs, a lot of power, a Juggernaut and a Cosmo, never hurt anyone. Well, except for everyone you play against. This is a very powerful list that is going to stress a lot of what you are capable of, and frankly, does have a bit of a binary thing going on, where you want to be a Heimdall deck, but you also sort of want to be a Juggernaut Cosmo deck. Another deck that has this problem occasionally is the ongoing lists, where they're playing like ongoing Juggernaut Cosmo, and they're also playing Spectrum, and you kind of have to choose which one you're going to be. A lot of Aurora lists have this same problem, where at a certain point you start thinking, am I supposed to cut the big guy? And I honestly do wonder that, but Heimdall is such a power spike when you don't need to interact that it just kind of ends up being in the deck anyway. It's a very interesting decision that you have to make, but it is one that will come up on end games a lot of the time. Largely, this deck is a lot of power, and again, we have Cosmo Juggernaut to deal with things like Man Spider that might be able to outpower us. We have arguably better point allocation than basically any other deck in the space, and most of what is going on here is just good points, reasonable interaction, lots of ways to redistribute them on the final turn of the game. You are very rarely out of games, but you're also doing a lot of very close wins. This is not a deck that has a lot of guaranteed dubs in it on the final turn of the game, because your guaranteed dubs make people leave. So you have a lot of very 50-50-ish games. In much the same way as you're basically never out of a game, your opponent is almost always also never out of the game if they get the correct read on what your final turn is going to be. This isn't necessarily a predictable deck, but the options that are available to it are things you can play both towards and against, which means that there are functionally a lot of 50-50s on the final turn with this deck. A deck that actually combines kind of the last two decks that we talked about comes from Roram. The idea here is basically that between Lin Lee and Hydra Stomper, there are just a bunch of ridiculously good targets for the Ancient One's Tau Mandala. I think this deck is legitimately really underrated. Like, this is just good. I really like what this deck is doing. I will say I'm a little bit iffy on Iron Fist over Ghost Spider. I think that makes some sense in some cases, but less sense in other cases. And it is the kind of thing where I think I want to Ghost Spider for the Lin Lee stuff, but I can't be 100% positive, because sometimes you'll run into situations where if you do the Ghost Spider Lin Lee thing, but you have a Batroc, the Batroc will clog the lane. It's a whole thing, right? Like, there are pros and cons to either of the one drops here. Now, the other thing this deck is doing is just a whole lot of points. The Ancient One multiplying these cards is really, really strong. The only thing you're going to really have to keep an eye out on, though, is that the Ancient One does not discriminate with the ongoings, and Sam Wilson's Shield isn't ongoing, so do keep that one in mind. You are going to have to pay a little bit of attention to that interaction. Other than that, though, this deck does pretty powerful stuff and has a real power spike that basically nobody expects, which means that it is a deck that a lot of people are going to lose to until they start realizing that Ancient One Tau Mandala is a very real thing. I really do think this is good. Like, this specific thing, the fact that there is overlap between Ancient One Hydra Stomper and Ancient One Lin Lee, you're doing a lot of big stuff. This is just not a high cost to pay to get the upside of going plus 24 in a lane. It's quite strong. Now, there is one issue here. This deck has literally no interaction. And I'm not saying that to say that that makes the deck bad. But what I am saying is that, like, when you compare it with the base move deck, the base move deck has already figured out how to fit the interaction that it wants into the shell. And this deck hasn't done that. And maybe it will in the future. And that's kind of a place to look. This is the kind of thing where it is going to try to outpower people, but sometimes you just will lose to a Man Spider or whatever, right? Like, you're just not going to have the power to deal with that some of the time because you don't have the cards. And at a certain point, we'll figure out what is core, what is important to this general shape of a deck, and we'll find out what isn't core, and then we'll be able to start customizing it to the metagame. This is a sort of rougher sketch, but it's one that I definitely think has potential. Supergiant has been a card that people have been saying is a good solution to show Lao for a while. In previous metagames, that is to say before the nerf, I don't think that was particularly true, because even when you turned off their combo, they would still have more points than you just by virtue of playing the cards they played. But the deck lost like 4 or 5 points, and now they are much more in range to lose to you when you do this. Like, there were previous situations where you would play the Supergiant deck, you'd be like, I've stopped them from comboing off. And it's like, okay, well, my turn 4 play was Maverick. I'm still going to be able to show out the Maverick. Like, I don't care, dude. Like, that kind of stuff, it was real, right? Like, there's just like enough power in the deck, especially in Sholo himself, that even when they weren't doing all of their duplicates, they were doing enough that they would still probably beat you just on the numbers they were outputting. And you were kind of like a Negasonic merchant or a Cosmo merchant or a face down Shadow King merchant. A lot of things had to go right for you. And now a lot less things have to go right for you. This deck just seems like it's a legitimately powerful thing. I really do want to highlight how good this kind of stuff is into like Merlin, Kate Bishop stuff. Having the ability to fill your opponent's hand up is absolutely phenomenal. Like, genuinely, this is the best time to play Master Mold since the last time I said it was the best time to play Master Mold, which was against the same deck, which is now weaker. So I guess this is an even better time to play Master Mold. I think this is very solid. I plan on doing a co-stream with Gamer on my Twitch channel, so we can get some sort of master piloting course in Supergiant gameplay tonight. So make sure you stop by around 11 p.m. over on Twitch. I hope you enjoy. That is Eastern time. And yeah, this is a really, really strong deck right now. It's doing legitimate stuff, and I think that the loss of power to the Sholo decks brings them so much closer to what this deck is able to do to actually beat it, that, like, even when you're not Supergianting, you can still compete. And that's a really big deal. The other thing this deck does is generally harass people who are doing specific combo things. It can backfire. There are decks that are very happy to not be able to play on turn 5. But, for example, a Man Spider deck a lot of the time will be gotten by the way this plays out. Like, that kind of stuff is super real in that matchup. Cosmo 2, if you can get it in here, which it's in this list, it's out of some other lists. We'll see how things end up panning out for this. Nobody's clipping me on Twitter for that one. But there are some things about this list that are, I think, really good, and some things about this list that maybe not as good. This is a list that's definitely trying to cover all of its bases, right? You got Mercury for the move decks. You've got the Cosmo in here. You've got the Shadow King in here. And sometimes that can lead to like a lower power output or like worse early game, that kind of stuff. You've got your Scarlet Witch for the various things that are going to be playing Limbo. It's definitely covering bases very well. But there are going to be games where you don't need to cover those bases and you just need to output points. And that's really where this deck is benefiting from the changes, because those games where you're just going points for points, well, they have like 4 or 5 less points now. And that actually is quite impactful when you're doing that. Speaking of hybrid show decks, one of the interesting things that has happened since the release of Sholo is the devaluation of Shadow King. This deck is sort of trying to use that to have like as many effective copies of Sholo as you possibly can. If you think of Sholo as just like 5 big, well, then Zombie Giant Man is basically another Sholo, and Werewolf by Night, if you really squint, can be another Sholo. These are cards that are weak to Shadow King, but what you're relying on is the other Sholo decks making Shadow King so mediocre that there just aren't going to be as many of them. And that's not a bad bet to make. I think it's actually a pretty solid bet to make. Just jam a bunch of power in here, try to beat the other Sholo decks by doing Sholo stuff that just have more power than them. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Now, the issue is you can still really get got by the pure combo draws out of a normal Sholo deck. You have a lot of power in here, and that's real. But there is still some conflict between, like, when are you going to play your stuff? A lot of the times when I play a deck like this, what happens is I'll have like a hand where I've got, like, Zombie Scarlet Witch, I've got a Prowler, and I've got a Werewolf by Night. And I can't play all 3 of those in the course of a game. And that kind of stuff is really tough to evaluate how I'm meant to actually process this. It's good. I don't want you to act like this isn't a good deck. It is. But there's also just, like, a general amount of straightforwardness in this list in terms of what you do, which is just make a bunch of points, and a shocking amount of complexity in terms of the route you take to get there, which makes me think it might not be the best list for someone who isn't super involved in planning out their turns. Cerebro 4 is Cerebro 4. It kind of fits a similar space as Supergiant, which is largely because of Invisible Woman. Like, face down Invisible Woman Shadow King actually is one of the ways you can make Shadow King really good against Sholo, because typically they are very good at throwing priority. So normally Shadow King not so good. Having it be face down is a really good thing to do. The Supergiant deck takes advantage of this as well, but you can also use this to say, protect your cards from interaction. Like your Cerebro can be under here. That kind of stuff is important. This is still C4. I don't want people to act like this is like the world's most amazing deck. Oh my God, it's Cerebro 4. It's the greatest thing to ever. Like, it's still a Cerebro deck. It still has the weaknesses Cerebro decks have, but it does get access to IWSK, and that is genuinely just a really good space for a deck to be in right now, and there aren't very many decks that get to do that. It's kind of just Supergiant in this, and this deck has more points in it because it's a Cerebro deck, so there is some upside here. Now, the downside is every game you lose because of some BS that was outside of your control. That is a very real consequence of Cerebro gameplay, is like, whoops, my bad. I should have played around these locations better, by which I mean they shouldn't have shown up. That's real. No arguments here. Jay Walla list number 2 here is the Arishem list he's been playing. Now, he has cut Stardust for M'Baku for the fun of it. It's wrong, and so I'm not doing that. But this is a deck that is shockingly competent into a shocking amount of things. If you want to play a fair mid-range deck right now, and you don't want to be like, ooh, I'm multiplying the power of my Mavericking my Sholo, I'm Scarlet Spidering my Sholo, I'm multiplying the power of my buffs, I'm a synergy combo deck, actually, that just looks like a mid-range deck. If you want to play an actual mid-range deck, this is what this one looks like. You gotta do this. I'm sorry. I don't like to be the bearer of this news. I don't want to be the guy telling you that Arishem is the fair mid-range deck, but I am, and it is. These disruptive pieces like Supergiant and Man-Thing are just actually quite good. Like, there's a lot of things a Man-Thing takes a dump on right now, especially when you're playing it out on turn 3. Just a lot of good stuff that can happen here. Oh, you played a Maverick, a Man-Thinging the lane. Like, yeah, is that incredibly impactful if they are going to be show-allowing it? Not the most impactful, but impactful enough. It matters. It's like -4 power. Like, this deck does stuff. The Lady Deathstrike is a very relevant card. The Alioth is extremely relevant. Sometimes you have these Galactus scams that you can have access to as well. Just generally a lot of good cards in here and a lot of very well-chosen tech pieces against the metagame. I got this Hela list from KM Worst. It just does not want to see a Stardust at all, but it is still a reasonably powerful list. If there's a problem with this list, it's largely the problem that all Hela lists have right now, which is they're not exactly guaranteed to beat a Sholo deck's output. Like, I played against the Hela deck when I was playing the Sholo Batroc deck. And it was like turn 3, and their Gambit hit my Sam Wilson and discarded something that was actually like big, right? Or it hit the Sam Wilson shield. But it discarded something that was big, right? I was like, that's a real thing. I've got to respect that. But when I looked at the power output I was going to get, and I looked at the power output they were going to get, I was like, you know what? I actually just think I'm favored against this. Even if they have like a good Hela, I think I'm good to go. And so I snapped and they left. And that's interesting. It's not a dynamic that mid-range decks typically have against Hela. It's reflective of the ceiling of the current mid-range decks and the relatively lower ceiling of Hela as a combo deck compared to something like Man-Spider. This is still a very solid list, though. I am pretty firmly convinced that if Man-Spider wants to have legs, it is... Sorry, yeah, it's got 8 legs. I'm pretty firmly convinced that if Man-Spider wants to have legs in this metagame, other than the 8 that it already has, I think that it probably needs to be this version. I respect the turn 5 Man-Spider, turn 6, fastball adamantium. I respect it. But I think there's probably just a little bit too much Cosmo for me to want to be that. I don't think it's a bad deck. I just think that I really would like to avoid getting aided by Cosmos. Like, I think Cosmo is a really good card right now. I think you'll see a very reasonable amount of him. And I think that I don't want to put myself in a position where it's very obvious that I get got. Like, at best, you're 50-50ing a Man-Spider versus a Taskmaster, and that's good enough that the deck still works, don't get me wrong. Or you're 50-50ing the Boom and Revive versus a Taskmaster. Like, that's good. Again, I don't want to act like it's bad. But I don't like the positioning of the spells version, and I do like the positioning of this one a whole lot more. Like, a whole lot more. I also think this one's going to get a pretty massive upgrade in the form of the card coming out on Tuesday, which is the Season Pass card Star-Lord Master of the Sun. Now, that unfortunately will also play more into Cosmo, because the weaknesses this deck has into Cosmo are largely related to Symbiote Spider-Man Fallen One. If they Cosmo the Symbiote Spider-Man lane, you're in a lot of trouble. Still true. But this deck is effectively getting a second Fallen One on Tuesday, and I think that's like a really scary prospect for the metagame. Last up is a deck I just really want to be real. I worry that this will end up falling behind the other versions of Sholo, but what I like about this list is it integrates Sholo into its game plan while hybridizing with something that really synergizes with Sholo. Which is to say, I think on the whole, this package is a little bit weaker than the move hybridization, but it does allow you a more complete game, and I think that's an interesting trade-off. And I'm interested to see where this goes, basically, because there is a world where this doesn't have to be more power than the move deck in terms of having the non-Sholo game plan, if it is able to support the deck meaningfully. Like, the question is, how close is this in power to the move hybridization? Because if it's close enough, the fact that it works better with Sholo does edge it towards this being a good build. I'm not sure it's close enough. Just fundamentally, I am not sure. And I think that that is largely the thing holding me back about it, but mostly I am fairly excited to see this. Now, this is sort of a response to Deafening Chord kind of sucking, because you kind of run out of like one drops you actually want to be doing in the deck. Like, you're like, oh yeah, there's really not a lot here unless I'm going to play for board slots and things of that nature. Like, it does matter. Merlin is now a much higher priority, and this deck actually gets to play Merlin, unlike the Batroc versions, which can't afford to play Merlin because they don't have enough one-drops, so they need one-drops that actually have the ability to target things, which means they need to play Kate Bishop instead of the Merlin. All of that stuff, like, this is what I mean when I say if this deck gets close enough in power output to the move one, I think it will end up being better. I just don't know that it's close enough. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I will see you in the next one. I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Remember to like and subscribe, and have a wonderful evening.